Umlana Blat Gemara. Today's daf is daf Zayin, and we're up to the Vav of the bottom of the page. So, the Mishnah, we're talking now about a Kohen Mashiach, Kohen Gadol, and that a Kohen Gadol is unique, that if he commits any Aveda, that normally you bring a Karban Chatas, the 36 Avedas, that if you did it deliberately, you get Karis. You did it inadvertently, you bring a Karban Chatas. That a Kohen Gadol does not bring a Karban Chatas unless, like a Tzibur, there was a Helim Dover. That means he paskined to himself thinking that it's permitted, and then he went ahead and acted on that psak. But if he did not pass, he just didn't have it like anybody else. He ate treifa fats by mistake. He does not bring a karban chatas at all. He is different. It says ma'am ha'oretz ba'asoisa, only an am ha'oretz, and a kohen gadol is not an am ha'oretz. And then we have another category called a nasi. A nasi does bring a carbon on a shigas ma'isa just like anybody else. The difference between a nasi and everybody else is everybody else has a choice. You can bring either a lamb or a goat. A nasi can only bring a goat. That's with the difference of a Nasi and everybody else. But a Kohen Mashiach is exactly like a Hayru Bezin, like a Tzibur. A Kohen Gadol represents the entire Tzibur. So he's like a Tzibur, and he has a number of dinim that are like a Tzibur. So first he has to paskin, just like a Bezin has to paskin, and he has to act on it. And he has to also be qualified to paskin. As we said yesterday, he has to be like a mufla. He has to be a qualified person that he can paskin. Otherwise, the psak is not a valid psak. We're talking about somebody's a valid psak. Says the Gemara on the bottom of the page, mazid, just like a bayat tzibur. If the bezin been mazid, and then the bezin knew they were paskening wrong, but the people did it by mistake, or the bezin made a mistake, but the people knew the bezin was wrong, that does not fall under the category of hayru bezin. They don't bring that special par. So the same thing with a kohen gadol. Says the Gemara, how do you know that a kohen gadol is just like bezin? Talking about me in the pasuk, in the Braisa, it says in the pasuk that if the Kohen Mashiach sins, and it says le'ashma sa'am, to the guilt of the people. So we daich that what Hari Mashiach Kitzibur le'ashma sa'am means that he's just like the He has the same dinim like the Says the Gemara, I would have thought that I don't need a pasuk. Why do I need a pasuk? Why do I need a pasuk le'ashma sa'am? So we are just learning right now. We just started that a Kohen Gadol has the same din like a tzibur, and that the only time that he brings a karban chatas is if he paskin that it was mutter, and then it turned out to be that he was wrong, and he acted on that psak. Now, and how do we know that? Because it says in the pasuk that if a kohen gadol sins, la'ashma sa'am, im a kohen mashiach, yechtel la'ashma sa'am. So on the bottom of the page, Roma base. Says the Gemara, why do I need a pasuk? Well, the din l'chayda makes sense. Tzibur mutza miklal yachid. A tzibur is different than a yachid. A yachid, when they do an avera by mistake, they bring a carbon, a sheep, or a lamb or a goat. A tzibur, they bring a par. Mashiach mutza miklal yachid. So too, the same thing with kohen Mashiach. A kohen gadol does not bring a kizba seir; he brings a par. So just like mat tzibur ein chayov and el al hel dovish gigmais, just like a tzibur does not bring a carbon unless the bezin paskin and the people behave. So at Mashiach la yechai el hel dovish because same kohen Mashiach, same thing. Why do I need the pasuk la ashmasam? It makes sense anyway. Because there's another way of looking at it. Because there's another category that's different than everybody else. Nasi. A Nasi and a Kohen Gadol are both included when it says Nefesh Achas. They're also Nefesh Achas. Okay, Tzibur is not included. They're not a Nefesh Achas. They should be included. And yet a Nasi also is different. Mutzah Miklal Yochid. A Nasi is also different Miklal Yochid. How? Because everyone else has a choice of bringing a lamb or bringing a goat. A Nasi has no choice but to bring a goat. So to a Kohen Gadol. So maybe you compare the Kohen Gadol not to the Tzibur. In a way, it makes more sense to compare him to a Nasi because they're both individuals. My Nasi maybe because he's nice, and Nasi is no different than everybody else. He doesn't have Veda. He ate treifa fats by mistake, not because he paskin. He just didn't realize it was treifa fats or whatever. He brings a karmachatas. Mashiach maybe because he's nice, so Mashiach also Kohen Mashiach maybe also doesn't need a helam dover. Neither lemid. Let us see who's more comparable. Who's a Kohen Gadol more comparable? Tzibur or to a Nasi? Because we're asking why we need that extra pasuk lashmas l'chayda we could have figured out on our own. So you have two choices, right? Compared to Tzibur, compare him to a Nasi. So let's see, who is he more comparable to? Tzibur bepar. A Tzibur brings what kind of animal? A par. Remember, a Nasi brings a goat. So that's so l'chayda, and a Kohen Gadol brings a par also. So already you see here, Kohen Gadol similar to the par. Number one. Number two, ve'ein mevi'in asham tali, that a Kohen Gadol nor a tzibur ever bring an asham tali. I will see in the Gemara soon. Number two. Um, and the reason we'll see is later that when do you bring a carbon asham, it says shigos as a shogat, says a double shagig there. We learn out only those who are chayv as soon as they do a shagig. But a tzibur needs also first a precursor, a helam davar. First, there has to be a psak, and a kohen gadol also first there has to be a psak, as well from the pasuk. So therefore, they are not included in asham tali because asham tali is only by anyone that would bring a carbon chatas. If there's a shagig on its own, you bring a carbon asham tali when you don't know if the piece what you ate was with kosher fats or treifa fat. You don't know. It's an asham tali. It was a shuman, it was a chaleb. But by kohen gadol, so you already have two things in common between a kohen gadol and a tzibur. And third, maybe Tali, Mashiach, and Mashiach is a par, so they have two dinim which are similar. Just like a tzibur chayv, unless there was a helam, and Shigis Maises, so too, Mashiach is also an helam davar Shigis Maises. Now that gufa is a little bit hard to understand because the only way we know that a kohen gadol is not chayiv and asham toli is because we first established that he has to have a helam davar. And now we're trying to prove that he has to have a helam davar. So the Gemara will say that this asham thing we only brought kadi nazir, we only brought b'der chaga. The main thing is about the kind of animal they bring for their carbon. So you have two things in common with tzibur. You go another way. Nasi maybe seira, but when it comes to avodah zara, there a kohen gadol brings the same carbon as a nasi. Nasi maybe seira b'avodah chavim. A nasi brings a goat by avodah zara. Because it says over there, "V'im nefesh," any nefesh. So and the nasi is a nefesh, and we'll see later that our kohen gadol also, when it comes to avodah zarah, is different. He brings a goat, not the par, but a goat. Maybe asham vade, and when it comes to an asham vade, like we have a thing called an asham gzelis. You know, when you lie, you swore false, or asham meilis. So over there, the kohen gadol is shaykh. And so is because again they're a single person, but a tzibur does not bring an oshavade. Umashiach maybe also se'ila b'avayichavim. And the reason, one of the reasons, a few reasons, but one of the reasons why by tzibur you don't have asham vada is because the whole end of a tzibur is helam davar. The whole end of asham vada is that it's bemazed. Asham vada you only bring when you bemazed. You swore false. You knew that you swore false bemazed. There's no such thing as asham vada by a suffix. So therefore, it's not tried by tzibur. But by kohen gadol, just like a nasi, there is asham vada. So you also have a few points that are similar between a kohen gadol and a nasi. So that's why we don't know. That's why we need a pasuk. Lash was on. Which one compared to? Maybe asham vada. Manasi maybe b'shigas ma'isa and l'chayda you would then say since the nasi brings a carbon every time they do a shagig, so maybe also b'shigas, maybe b'shigas ma'isa. Now what? That's why we need the pasuk la'ashvazam because we don't know who to compare it to. So tzibur or to nasi they have the things that come in here and things that come in there. Harehu Mashiach Ketziba. Mat. Therefore, we learn from there what? Mat tzibur and maybe I'll help David Mashiach Ma'isa. Mashiach and maybe I'll help David Mashiach Ma'isa. Says the Gemara, why don't you just say also ma tzibur, just like a tzibur? How does a tzibur work? The bezin paskins and other people have to follow your psak. Remember we had before, the only ones who are doing it is the bezin. You don't have the concept of hoyde bezin. So l'chayde ma tzibur hoyde, but also achaydim b'hoyde also and chayavin. So maybe Mashiach also, maybe a kohen gadol kisha hoyde, but also acher b'hoyde also yehei chayiv. Let's say he makes a psak, but he doesn't do it himself. Others follow it. You should be chayiv. If you're comparing it to tzibur, go all the way. If we have a pasuk, it says by a kohen Mashiach, he sins la'ashma sa'om b'hikriv al chatosoy asher chata, that he sinned. Amashachata you maybe mashachata chaydim. So there we have a pasuk that clearly limits how far we take it when we compare to tzibur. Amar you said Mashiach probably for himself for sure. Everyone can pass himself. No. So we're saying we would have thought. We're talking about we said before that he's a mufla, and the mufla of the bezin, as Rashi and others trying to point out, can't be talking about somebody's a member of the bezin of the Sanhedrin, because then you don't have to be a mufla. Because we said before, if one member of the Sanhedrin doesn't agree, he doesn't have the Nehar bezin, so he's not part of the Sanhedrin, but he's equal to the Sanhedrin. So Gemara said, "Oh my." We're talking about if he's he has to be 300 and something, yeah. Exactly. We learn Mashiach b'par maybe Oshim Toli. What he does not bring an Oshim Toli. Minoli de Mesh Toli. Let me ask you a question. How do you know? You made an assumption that a Kohen Gadol doesn't in part of your drive here. Before we knew the pasuk La'ashmas and you were comparing the Tzibur and Nasi, you said that what? That a Kohen Gadol is like a Tzibur. You don't bring an Oshim Toli. How do you know that you don't bring Oshim Toli? Because the pasuk says v'chipet olav haKohen. The Kohen will forgive them. Al shigosay asher shogat. It says a double shagig. We dashin. Me shechata asa v'shgagase shavet. If this person brings a chatas on a shagig, you didn't realize before, you didn't know the fat whatever it's asa, and you ate it b'shagig, you bring a carbon. But a kohen gadol doesn't do that. Yotze Mashiach ain't good b'chadashah, but a kohen gadol has to have a hell number first. But that's the point we're trying to prove out. We don't know yet that kohen gadol doesn't need a hell number. That's what we're trying to say. And you're telling me you don't need the pasuk because we know that he doesn't. That's the whole point. We're trying to learn out that a kohen gadol needs a hell number before. The Tiv Lashmadam, how do you Mashiach Kitzib Lashmadam? And when I answered, you're right. Oshim, you're right. It's not part of the discussion. It was brought just the Chagam. That was not the main comparison between the two. The main comparison is the type of carbon you brought. That you brought a par, not a kizbah, not a seir. So the Mishnah continued talking about a kohen gadol and the comparisons to a tzibur. Hoide bifnei atzmai, but also bifnei atzmai. If he paskin for himself, a kohen gadol. That's interesting. What happened? He paskin for himself a certain isa, whatever the isa was, and the bezin at the same time paskin another isa. For example, the bezin paskin a certain avodah zarah is mutter, and he paskin that chaylev is mutter. Okay, he cannot be included in this. And then after the bezin realized he cannot be included in the part that the bezin does because he did a totally different avodah, so therefore it's separate. But what happened if even the bezin were paskin the same thing? They came to the same conclusion that chaylev is mutter, but he did it on his own. He came to the conclusion that chaylev was mutter, and he acted. Bezin came to the conclusion that certain kinds, remember, certain kind, chaylev aladaka, chaylev alakeva, certain kinds of fats, but not all of it, because he can't uproot entire mitzvah. They both came to the same conclusion, but he did it on his own, and they did it on his own. Then he could be included in the tzibah. He doesn't have to bring a separate card. Why? Since they both have the same din. This is how some learn. They both have the same din that he cannot uproot the entire mitzvah, but just a partial. You say this the mitzvah applies, but not this particular detail. Since they both are the same thing, so therefore he is considered part of the am as well. And and interesting. So Rashi wants to point out. It says there ain't bezin chayovin achi yodu. Bezin is not chayv. This follows Rab Meir. Remember, he had Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. They both say, well, Rabbi Yehuda says it's the Yidden who bring the carbon, not the bezin. And Rabbi Shimon says they both bring the carbon. But because the Mishnah says she ain't bezin chayovin, it sounds like the bezin brings the carbon. So this follows. In fact, all the Mishnayos, Stam Mishnayos, and Hoyde follow Rab Meir. The Chayin, likewise, Mashiach. The same thing by Kohen Gadol. The same thing by Kohen Gadol. Why you cannot undermine the time mitzvah. And so to when do we say the din of Hoyde Bezin? Not Shigayel. The battle mitzvah, the kind mitzvah. He has to agree to partial mitzvah and uproot part of the mitzvah. You cannot uproot the time mitzvah. Says the Gemara, how do you know this? What have I learned? If he paskin with the tzibur and he behaved accordingly, I would have thought that even so, because he paskin for himself, he didn't rely on the bezin, and even though it's the same outcome and everything else, he should bring his own par. The dinu l'chayda, it makes sense that he's separate. Nasi mutzim miklal yochid, like I said before, Nasi is different than everybody else. He brings only a goat. Everyone else has a choice. Mashiach mutzim miklal yochid, and the Mashiach is also excluded. He brings a par. Man Nasi chad b'fnei atzmai, maybe b'fnei atzmai chati matzim eschapel mitzvah. So just like a Nasi, when he does his own avodah, he brings on carbon like anybody else. If he's part of the tzibur, he's part of the tzibur. He's included in the par. So ask Mashiach, same thing about Mashiach. That's the chad b'fnei atzmai, maybe b'fnei atzmai chati matzim eschapel mitzvah. So the same thing. Yeah. Loy no. Im amret. Min Nasi she came as chapela im hatzibur yom kippurim. A Nasi is included with Klal Yisrael when it comes to Yom Kippur. But what do we know about a Kohen God? The Kohen brought their own carbon. So I would have thought that even though it's the same Aved everybody else, but you're a separate person. And therefore the Kohenim have to have their own carbon. Since he made his own psak, even though it's the same as the Bezin. Therefore, we have a pasuk. It says, "Al chatosai asher chat." What do you mean on the sin that he sinned personally? Okay, so if he sinned separate from everybody else, maybe from the outside. But if it's the same sin that everybody else did, like what are you talking about? I remember before we said that when do we say Hoyda Bezin, that not only the entire Bezin has to be there, but also the Mufla. So I said that we learned yesterday, it's actually talking about the Mufla. That we also need the Mufla because we say otherwise, had the Mufla, the smartest guy, been there, even though it's not part of the head, and then you would have told him, hey, you're making an error. In Allah. So then it's not a real psak, only the mufla. So what's going on? Who's the mufla? You tell me there's the Kohen Gadol made a psak and the bezin, and they're both psakim are psakim. How can that be? Manusha. Ilema the whom mufla that he's the expert, but hey main mufla in the pshita, the mischapler of nasma. He has to have his own kapara. Because by Klal Yisrael, every yid is going to have to bring their own carbon because there's no psak. A bezin, a sanhedrin without a mufla is not a psak. Boy, I see kids by see the kochad bechad. Every year, bring their own carbon. Every year, in the muflain, and it doesn't head in the ones who have the expert by them. That means who lab mufla, Kohen Gadol is not the mufla. Then his psak is not a psak. Then a man is couple of that. Wasn't he? He doesn't have a shigas hayra. He didn't make a mistake at all because he can't pass. He's not qualified. You have to be a qualified person. You need, and the only way you qualify for your mufla. Oh, he didn't have klumu. His hayra is worthless. And you can have two experts. The Sanhedrin had their mufla there, and he was also mufla. So by the Mishnah started out saying that if he did a separate Aveda, then even though he made a mistake at the same time, the best but with different Avedas, then they all bring their separate kabbanis. So Abaye thought that what do you mean separate? Not only separate Aveda, but in a separate place. Omar Abaye Mem chet bifnei atzmei va'asa bifnei atzmei. Hey, what do you mean? The Yasi b'shnei mekayim. They sat in two separate places. Like the Bezin was in one place and the Kayim was in another place. The Kamayim says you need two things, two places and two psakim. Who might not come in where he was standing. The main thing is the halach. Actually, we have a big machlekes in the Gemara in Yevamis about the Bate Dinin. You have to have two separate places. We said two Bate Dinin. What about in the same city? You have two Bate Dinin. Are they considered like two separate places or considered like one place? Like you can't have state traders. We played a similar machlekes here. So two places make a difference. In the same place. The kivan the kamoiru betrei yisuda two separate avedas. Separate avedas. Says the Gemara, what's separate avedas? Shita who bechele behein bavodah. Let's say the Kohen Gadol paskin that certain kind of chayil is mutter, and they paskin, for example, before bowing down is only if you're lying down with your hands and prostrate yourself. That's surely two separate Aved. Don't talk about it. The source of the Aved is very different, and chalukin b'kabanis. The carbon you bring for a avodah zarah seir is different than the carbon. You bring a pot and let's say you made a mistake in avodah zarah, you bring a pot and a soyer b'shenkin. Normal, you only bring a par. So even though they overlap, they both bring a par. But here you have an additional carbon by avodah zarah. You bring a goat. The par and par soyer. That what the Eden bring for avodah zarah, they bring in addition to the par soyer. He only bring a par. So it's not the same carbon. So surely it's considered two separate events. Okay. The Chosh can surely, if who he paskin regarding avodah zarah, which means he brings only a soy. If he does it individually, he brings only a goat. The Hain Bechelim and the Bezin paskin they bring a par. It's not even overlapping. Two separate components. The Chalukim becomes in a Gambri. Don't talk about the who see the being a part. But two separate events. So therefore he has to bring his own carbon. Ella, who bechelim amachatzas akede beheim bechel shaladaki. What about they both talk about fats? But they were talking about the fats that was on the inner. He was talking about the fats that was, let's say, on the intestine. Two separate, even though they're both called chelim, but they're two separate dinim. How do we treat that? Mao. Me, I mean, do we say I've got the carbon shava? The same carbon chatas, the same animals, the choice kibbutz. They both bring a part of Kohen Gadol and the kibbutz. But kibbutz the mitrei kroy gazi. Because they're coming with psukim, the source is different. Is that enough to make it different? And the Kohen Gadol has to bring it on carbon. In Tim you both say, listen, they're both the Isra of fats, and that's a detail. If it's a chayil or a dak, what about who bechayil him adam? What about that he, let's say, paskin regarding fats, that this particular fats is not also, and they were talking about a certain dam, a certain blood is not also. Mahu. The Rashi says a fascinating thing. What's the psak by dam? Either Rashi says they talked about blood that was absorbed in the Eivarim in the limb, not the dam that comes out when you shech the dam, but the blood inside the limbs. The Chachamim, and so it's something Zdukim are not moida. They don't call that dam, and the Chachamim say that it's mutter to the Israel. Or says Rashi Chatzi Shir. The Chachamim came along to Chatzi Shir mutter, and the Zdukim are not moida Chatzi Shir, and that was their mistake. All the Achreim, every Acher that I saw. It asks, but the rule is that when do we say Hoyle Bezin? Something if you did it, but makes you get chorus, and B'Shei you bring Karmachatis. But Chatzi Shir, there's no chorus, there's no Karmachatis, it's only a lav. Dam Hamuvla Beivarim is no chorus, there's no Chatzis, it's only a lav. What's going on here? They all come with very interesting answers. But someone to say the easiest answer is, but Dam generally you get chorus, and that's enough. You don't mean that this particular psak has to bring these one of chorus. Others say kazayis means the size of the kazayis. Not that the Rashi meant less. No, it's the Chachamim. A small zayis is a kazayis. The Zdukim hold only a large kazayis, and that's the mistake that Bezin made. They said it has to be a large kazayis. So therefore, there is chorus by a kazayis, and they made a mistake in something. Or if kazayis you have to eat in one gulp, or do we combine it b'chdei achilas pras? And it was a full kazayis, but it took you a few minutes to eat it. Zdukim don't agree with b'chdei achilas pras, and that's where the mistake was. And again, and there is therefore a korban because if you ate a kazayis b'chdei achilas pras, you bring a korban chatas and you taking one further. So the question is, I'm you say, but tabayu on the one hand, it's two different avedas. You're keeping the shama carbon, the same carbon, but the carbon didn't take. Remain the question. When you chayiv only if you uproot part of the mitzvah. How do you know? We already had this whole gemara before. We brought three different sources. Yet the gemara is leading into the question regarding a kohen gadol, so we start off the same way. How do you know the achi yoyel levatul mitzvah mitzvahs? Maybe even if you uproot the entire mitzvah, say there's no such isser as fats, taste of fats, is also a din of her bezin. So we could, and be because what itself said. We learned before the nelim dover. If you remember, you had three different ways, but if this way is you take the mem from the word the nelim and you add it to the word dover. The nelim mid dover. That you forgot part of the mitzvah. Double color, not in typing. Now the same thing applies to kohen gadol. That a kohen gadol is not chayiv unless it's only uprooted part of the mitzvah. How do you know? Minolan again the chsiv la ash masa'am that he's compared to ash masa'am to a tzibur. I'm a sheikh tzibur. But later when I avoid zara, how you know that? Tell me learn the vishiyatza. You come lead the batzma. Avoid zara. The Torah has a whole parsha by Yikra, and then in parsha Shlach, which similar subject, but there the whole community made a mistake. But there it's a Shlach and talking about avoid zara. Because kol mitzvah Hashem, but we said which mitzvah is equal. So all the mitzvahs avoid zara. You thought about learn the vishiyatza. Avoid the chavim. Since the Torah decided to write about avoid the chavim. Even though it's no different than any other mitzvah, yet the Torah decided to make a whole parsha on its own. The Torah took out the case of Avodah Zarah and made a separate parsha out of it. Is Yochel Yechayav? I would have thought that Avodah Zarah is different. Why did the Torah highlight it separately? Maybe to tell you about Avodah Zarah, even if you just said there's no such thing as Avodah Zarah, maybe there's the din of Hoyle Bezin, you relied on the Bezin. Nema kind of different. It says over here about Avodah Zarah me'enei. The Nema lahalan says then other part talk about general mitzvah that says me'enei about there was nelam me'enei. Hey, the malahalam the bezin of Canaan bezin. There in Vayikra is talking about the bezin. It says enei hakol. So here also is talking about the bezin. That the Gemara malahalam dover like kol aguf, and just like over there we know it's only dover, right? It says nelam mid dover, nelam dover. Akanam dover like kol aguf. Mishnah ain't chayav in Allah dover in Shugis Meiser. You're not chayav only if it's helam dover. Remember, and the Shugis Meiser. Chein HaMashiach. Same thing by Avodah Zarah ain't chayav in Allah dover in Shugis Meiser. You need both. But here it doesn't say v'chein HaMashiach. And the Gemara is going to wonder maybe Avodah Zarah is different that a Kohen Gadol is not. By Avodah Zarah maybe it's different than everywhere else. Then Gemara we'll see some machlekes tanoim. Then Gemara know how do you know? Tell me learn. So we learn that it says in the pasuk that in Kol Adas Yisrael Yishgu v'nel Lemenakol Yishgu they made a shogeg and Yochli Chayav Yemais. I would have thought that Chayav if all the Yidden do and I made it together, you bring the special carbon. Tamlema Yishgu v'nelem Dover ain't Chayav. You're not Chayav unless it was a Helam. When do you say they get a special carbon that one carbon for everybody? You need you forgot that it's an aveda and through a psak and a shaygi. The chain hamashiach, same two other things applies to a kohen gadol. We know how you know that. It says la'ash v'zam. Hamashiach kitzib. The same word la'ash v'zam. Below by Yicham El Helm Davish, you can ma'asim minon. How do you know about the same thing? The Torah Rami learned the feature yotzav Yicham Lilma'atzma because the Torah made a separate parsha for Avodah Zarah. Yochel Yichayav and Yicham Ma'aser. I would have thought that maybe that's different. Maybe Avodah Zarah, if everyone doing Avodah Zarah together, b'sheigim, forget about the psak. Maybe you bring a special carbon. I'm in the mechanics, same thing we said before. So over here, May Aina, it says May Aina Aida Nesel Goga, and then Lahalon, it says by Yikra, it says May Aina Hako. Malahal and Chum and Helm Dover. Because Maisa, look over there, it has to be Helm Dover. Which is the same thing over here, because it says Helm Dover is Afkan and Chum and Helm Dover, because Maisa. No, what about Mashiach? Says Gemara, Koyim Mashiach, but we have like Tani must listen. Like Tani. The mission doesn't say by Avodah Zarah v'chein Mashiach. That Kohen Gadol has the same thing like everybody else. We need a psak and the Shigis Maisa. Masnisin Mani seems my mission that when it comes to Avodah Zarah, Kohen Gadol is no different than everybody else. But did Aveda b'Shegeg Avodah Zarah, he brings the curry even though there's no psak. Who holds that? So the Gemara that follows Rebbe. Tanya, we learn Mashiach b'Avodah Chavim. Rebbe says B'Shigis Maisa. Rebbe holds because of Avodah Zarah, a Kohen Gadol is no different than everybody else. You did a Shegeg, you bring a curry. Chacham Maimim behelim davar. Chacham is saying, no, it's no different than anything else. Kohen Gadol has to first have a psak and then a shaygi. The shavim, but they both agree that the carbon that he brings is not the par, even though normally a Kohen Gadol brings a par, but Avodah Zarah, he's like everybody else. He brings their carbon, which is a goat. The shavim, and they also say she'ain maybe osham toli, that a Kohen Gadol does not bring osham toli. Like we said before already, we said the word shaygi to tell you that only if you bring by other mitzvahs. Only for a shaygi bring a carbon. Since the Kohen Gadol needs also a psak, a helm dover with a carbon, therefore he's not included in the Asham Tov. The Tizbra, let's understand, the Chayda doesn't mention in the Mishnah that it has to be side by Kohen Gadol, just like a bezin, amazing chorus and shaygi chatas, and yet we know it is. So who said just because the Mishnah omitted it doesn't mean the Mishnah therefore follows Rebbe that a Kohen Gadol has different dinim? We know the din applies to a bezdin, so we know automatically it applies to Kohen Gadol. Only by those Avedas, the 36 Avedas have Kaddish, minus 5 that you don't bring Karbachatas, and they bring Karbachatas. No Hachinam here too. Tana it says who adin laha. It said by Tzibur that the din is you need a hell of a dover by Avodah Zarah with Shagig. So to Kohen Gadol, when the Mishnah admitted it, so what? Anyhow. My time with the Rebbe, what's this for a Rebbe? Oh, Makro, why do Rebbe hold when it comes to Avodah Zarah? Kohen Gadol does not have to have a psak. Oh, Makro, it says in Pasuk, "V'chiper haKohen ala nefesh," that the Kohen should forgive on the nefesh hashageges, that the nefesh that sinned b'chata b'shgoges, sinned b'shogeg. A nefesh, the Moshiach, the nefesh that is Moshiach and hashageges. So who is the nefesh hashageges? Like double. Just say hashagega. When you have nefesh, nefesh includes everybody. Every individual has a nefesh, which he doesn't have a nefesh. In fact, in Shulchan Aruch, I've many times says that a baal nefesh should be machmas. Who is he talking to? Who doesn't have a nefesh? The Gemara says here that every yid is a nefesh, even a Kohen Gadol, even a Kohen Gadol, nothing. Forget the Gemara saying a sour person definitely is a nefesh, even a Kohen Gadol is a nefesh. Hasha geges, what's the geges? Then nasi. And what's the din? That the chatosh gaga, that they did the chatos, they bring a shegi, they bring karba chatos. In other words, a Kohen Gadol is the same like everybody else, but it comes to Avodah Zarah. Rebbe holds that the gaga yehei, and as soon as did a shegi and a chet, forget about a psak. A Kohen Gadol is included in bringing a carbon. But Abban holds no. Mi shechatos b'shgaga. Only those people that do Aveda b'Shegig do they bring Karmachatas by Avodah Zarah as well. They bring Karmachatas. Yotze Mashiach she'ein chatos v'gaga. A Kohen Mashiach, generally speaking, has to paskin first of the heter before he makes his mistake. So the same thing by Avodah Zarah. He has to paskin and then do his mistake. But everyone agrees shebesida kiyach. Everyone agrees that you bring the carbon that the Kohen Gadol brings is a goat, not the par. Even a Kohen Chacham hold you have to paskin that it's mutter, and then he brings the carbon. But the carbon itself in this case is different than all the other cases of Kohen Gadol. He brings a seir. How do you know that? Especially Chachamim, they hold that he's no different than every other case. The par. Echad Yachid ve'echad Nasi. It says in the passage, if one nefesh sinned, he brings a goat. Who's nefesh achas? Anyone who's a single person. Kulam b'chal nefesh achas. It includes a kohen, includes a Mashiach. They're all included. See you tomorrow, Mr. Shem. Have a good day.